Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar, and once again, this is my opinion, and welcome to another episode of First Impressions, the series where I give my initial thoughts on a certain topic. Today, it's going to be a First Impressions film review of the third and final Stephen King adaptation we're getting this year, and in my opinion, of the three, it's the best one. And funny enough, they were released, at least with how I view them, in order of worst to best. I mean, you already know from my reviews of Pet Sematary and It Part 2 that I like them. Pet Sematary I like to a point. I think the third act is what saves it because it makes it feel different than the original. Even though it's shot and edited and all that differently, it just feels by the numbers the same type of film as the first one. Until they decide to kill the daughter instead of the son. It Part 2 I thought was a good follow-up to the first one. My only pet peeve being still no Maturin. How can you give the finger to the turtle of enormous girth? On his shell he holds the earth. His mind is slow, his smile is kind. He holds us all within his eye. He loves the land and he loves the sea, and he even loves a child like me. Then, of course, Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, which I sadly do not have a review of the book up on the channel right now, so one of these days I'm going to have to do a double literature review of The Shining and Dr. Sleep. We'll have to read them again, but it's a good back-to-back read now. Now, when I heard that they were officially moving forward with the film adaptation of that novel, my main question was, alright, depending on who makes this film, and by that I mean the studio, how are they going to do this? Are they going to make it a sequel to the miniseries? And if so, are they going to make that last shot non-canon? Are they going to make it a standalone film adaptation and just, when they reference The Shining, just do it loosey-goosey so it could be a sequel to the miniseries or the original film if the viewer wants it to be? Or just make it like it's a film sequel to the novel Shining? Or are they going to be ballsy and decide to make it a sequel to Kubrick's film, despite the fact that Kubrick's film, for lack of a better phrase, bastardized the book in translation? They actually went with that last one. It's a film sequel to The Shining, which I have to say is pretty ballsy, considering it, and especially if you know Stephen King's thoughts on that film when it relates to how it adapted his source material. But I'll have to say, they did it. They made a very worthy sequel to The Shining. Now, if you are not a fan of The Shining, like I know one of my friends is, even though we like doing the little tat joke involving the Simpsons thing, no TV and no beer make Homer something something. Go crazy, don't mind if I do. What he's written will be a window into his madness. Despite that, you will probably like this film better. I haven't watched The Shining in a while, so I can't say if I like this one or that one better. I can definitely say it makes a lot more sense than The Shining, because The Shining, a lot of the stuff, it shows a lot of stuff visually, but then a lot of stuff is left vague and loosey-goosey. Like, when was Jack starting to go insane? Was he insane from the beginning and just trying to act normal? There's a lot of unanswered questions like that. Now, the plot is it picks up right after The Shining. We're introduced to Danny and his mother again. Danny is having trouble adjusting, and not just from the fact his father tried to kill him, but some of the ghosts from the Overlook have followed him. And he has to figure out what to do. Now, Dick Halloran helps him. In the movie, it's the spirit of Dick Halloran, because in the original, they killed him, spoiler alert, and he was alive in the book. So they translate that nicely. Just have it to be his spirit instead of him showing up to tell him himself. Well, he gives him an idea to use a lockbox to basically lock the spirits away and throw them to the back of his mind. Things you could do with The Shining. Which, for those of you who haven't read the book, that is an element from the original novel, so they translated that nicely. After he does it with the first ghost, it skips ahead to him as an adult, and we see that he has gone low. He's an alcoholic like his father. He's getting into fights, having one-night stands, and he steals money from this one-night stand, which is from the novel. This just shows how low he has gotten. And, the curse of the father going on to the son. Well, he moves to a different town again and decides to try and change his life here, and he eventually ends up in AA, and he holds down the job for years, and he gets sober. Now, the one thing that they don't really touch on with his alcohol is it kind of dulls the shining away. It's kind of like, I think it's Kate Skywalker in Star Wars Legends using the death sticks to keep the ghost of Luke away from him. Why do you use those things? They keep you away. Doesn't do a very good job because he still has little moments where Halloran speaks to him, but it's more like his mind speaking to him in that voice. You know, I guess we always sometimes speak to ourselves in a parent or a parental figure's voice when we're doing something we shouldn't, which I'm not going to spoil that little element. Well, at this same time, another child with the Shining is introduced, and that's Abra Stone, who is our secondary protagonist and Dan's long-distance Shining friend, as it were, because they communicate through the blackboard, which is a nice little thing. Makes a little more sense in the movie how she does it, because she's a child when she first meets him, and if I remember right, she's a toddler in the book, which is still a little weird, but I guess it shows the Shining connection. And it also connects with a plot element that they sadly did not keep into the book, which I will address later. Because I do have to just talk about how this plot element does change a little bit of the story. And it also makes the casting that they did make a little bit more sense, but it still would have made sense regardless with the mother's actress. Well, in addition to these two, we also have the True Knot, which are a group of humans that all have the Shining, but they misuse it. And what they do is that they use their powers to lure in children who also have the Shining, usually strong with it. They hurt them, and they suck out their power, and it maintains their youth. As we're introduced to them, they're bringing Snakebite Andy into their midst, who is the youngest physically and age-wise at this point member, and she's introduced. They are the True Knot, and they endure. And boy, did they make these scenes graphic. This film deserved its R rating, just the True Knot scenes alone. And of course, Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat. They couldn't have gotten a better actress to play this part. She is evil to the core. Well, as the film goes on, Abra discovers these two, and Rose really wants to get Abra because of how much power she has. In the film, I think they mentioned she is stronger than Danny. If not, they're comparable. Because if they had found out about Danny in the book, they would have wanted him. And the film actually does have a line where Rose actually addresses this as like, oh, what we could have done with you. Which, it's hard to tell if that line is just merely implying that Danny's powers have weakened since he was a kid, which I can confirm from the book they have. But that's something that appears to happen, is that your powers seem to dull a bit as you get older. I don't know if it's an imagination thing or just intentionally letting the muscle die, as it were. But of course with Danny is also the thing of him not wanting to use them fully. Or scared to use them fully. Well, the True Knot want to get their hands on Abra. Danny and his buddies have to help her and prevent the True Knot from doing it. Some people die on both sides. There is a firefight scene in the book, which is a little bit grander compared to how it is in the book, because in the movie it kills off everyone except two members of the True Knot, one of which was not there, and of course Rose, who decided to stay behind in a different area. They all do die in the book too, but it's not that way. And I could tell you, aside from the changes that they had to make to go with the changes that the original film made, the first third and a half of the film, so about first 2 hours of the film, are pretty faithful to the book. I mean, some elements are abridged and some are changed around a bit in order to accommodate the runtime of a film, but they're pretty accurate. And some lines of dialogue might not be verbatim, but we get the point across. The third part of the movie, the last half hour, which is essentially the third act, is changed and tweaked to accommodate the fact that the Overlook is still around. The third act in the novel still does take place at the Overlook, but the fact that the Overlook is still around in the movie, allows for a little bit more creative film presence, if you will. We get to have a nostalgic trip through the Overlook, reminding us of everything that happened in the first film. There is a nice little scene where Danny actually confronts the ghost of his father, which I was wondering when I saw that they were actually making this a sequel to the movie, if they were actually going to show Jack, because there is a scene in the book where they're at the location of the Overlook, because in the book the Overlook blows up, and Danny for a moment feels the spirit of Jack Torrance, but it's very fleeting. Here he actually has a full-on conversation with him, and I'm checking IMDb for the actor because I actually want to get this right. Here we are. In this movie, Jack Torrance, for his brief appearance, is played by Henry Thomas. Now, to some of you, that name is going to sound familiar. You know why that is? This is the kid who played Elliot in E.T. Yep, from one 80s classic to the sequel to another. And I didn't realize that was him, but as an adult, his face does kind of look a little bit like Jack Nicholson, so them doing it in the makeup, combined with him actually getting the vocal mannerisms Jack did in that film down, it definitely feels like they have that character back in the film. And the actress that played Wendy for the few scenes she's in also did a good job at getting the mannerisms that Wendy had in the first film down. That would be... I want to get her name right real quick. Alex Essoe, Essoe. They both got those mannerisms down to the pack. It felt like they just took the characters from the first film, put them in this film. I mean, they don't look exactly like him. I think Henry looks more like Jack Nicholson than the actress that played. Then Alex looks like Shelley Duvall, but they got the vocal speech patterns and everything down. And the guy that played Dick Halloran also felt like they had resurrected Scatman Crothers, other than the voices sounding a little different tone-wise. And that scene where its father and son are talking to each other, nice, and it actually is the first time, if I remember right, that we actually get to see this version of Jack Torrance say the "take your medicine" line. And the fact that it's echoing back to the Lloyd bartender scene in the first film makes it even better. And of course, eventually Danny does get the axe. And of course, the comeuppance they gave Rose is fitting. I'm not going to spoil it, but it is similar to what happens in the book, but it's different enough due to the context of the film. And it was satisfying to watch, but also sad with what happens afterwards. Now, for those wondering, I give this film at least a 4 out of 5, I believe. Probably have to watch it again just to set that one in stone or mull over, but it's in that neighborhood. It's filmed pretty well. Cinematography I thought was pretty good. Definitely felt like a continuation from the first film, but it just doesn't have that same auteur-ness that Kubrick gave the original, whether you like it or hate it. You have to admit that it definitely had his flair and touch on film. But Mike Flanagan gave us a worthy follow-up. And not his first directing job. He directed The Haunting of Hill House, Gerald's Game, so not his first King adaptation. Ouija, Oculus, Still Life, so that's probably one of his best work, but I'm a little biased in that regard. Now, this is the part of the review where I am going to talk some spoiler stuff involving the ending, because I have to talk about the major divergence from the end of the book. So if you don't want them, this is your warning. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In the third act, Danny becomes possessed, similarly to how his father was in the book. Chases Abra around, she gets out, and then the Overlook Hotel blows up like it did in the first film. So in a way, it kind of redeems the fact that Kubrick's film decided to cut that plot point out. But on the same thing, it does kill the happy ending vibe from the original, because both Danny and Abra survive the events in the original, and they have a little heart-to-heart at the ending, which ties into the one plot revelation this film decided to cut out for what I'm assuming is the reason they decided to use the ending from the first book here, because it would probably make that a little bit sadder. But also, you could also have that turn that ending from a happy ending into a bittersweet ending if you decide to keep it. And that is, we find out that Danny and Abra are related. I know someone's going to say, well, that's improbable. This book nerd will come back and tell you, as Chris Rock once said, not really. And this is something that I went with the first time I read the book, but then when I read it back to back with The Shining, I saw that there was enough wiggle room with the timeline for this to actually happen. Now, as it turns out, Danny and Abra's mother are half-siblings. Abra's mother was conceived while Jack still worked at the school that he was employed at when he broke Danny's arm, and before his old little thing with the kid popping his tire, which is only in the miniseries, or if you've only watched the film and haven't read the book or seen the miniseries, it's going to be a little foreign, but that's the event that led to him getting fired, which led to them moving across country, eventually Jack having to take the Overlook job in order to write the play and hopefully give the board more time to consider giving him his job back. But I know I gotta lower that ground a little bit. When he was heavily into drinking, he'd be out long nights, he'd be partying with coworkers, while Mrs. Torrance would be home with the baby, worrying about Jack, and also the usual wife thing of wondering, is he being faithful or not? Well, it turns out at least one of these instances he wasn't, because he cheated on her with a student teacher. The student teacher decided not to tell the teacher, and she had her. Now, this also kind of explains how Abra was able to make the mental connection with Danny, because I guess you could say it's the whole them being related, so their shinings are on similar wavelengths, to the point that even a little toddler could find him, especially if they're, from a planetary geographical standpoint, relatively close. Because if they're both on the eastern seaboard, they are relatively close speaking. It's not like one's in Japan and the other's on the eastern seaboard. We're about half a planet away from each other, where it's like, ooh, that's very convenient. But relatively close. They're within like at least 1,000 miles of each other, if less. And it also makes the fact that she calls him Uncle Danny not just a term of endearment, but him actually being her uncle. And it also lends a little bit more credence to her anger issues, which they did keep that in the movie, but in the movie it just comes off as her being annoyed and basically being like, oh, you do this to all these children? You were going to do it to me? Well, how's it feel to be turned about on you? You can dish it out, but you can't take it. As a great man once said, turnabout fair play, gorilla. I mean, it's almost 2 o'clock in the mornings. Give me a break if I get the announcer wrong. Turnabout flare play. Yeah, turnabout flare play. Well, in the last part of the book, Danny does give a nice little heartwarming speech to his niece at her birthday party that she'll have to learn to control her anger and, watch that she doesn't continue the cycle of violence, because it also brings in the fact that Jack's father was an abusive alcoholic fuckhead, which adds a little bit more to the tragedy that Danny ended up becoming an alcoholic as well, and he had some anger issues too, so it's a sins of both the father and the grandfather falling on him. And of course, in the book, when he's tempted, Jack is always thinking about his father. And while, if I remember right, he doesn't muse on the fact he's following in his footsteps, enough is there so that the reader can make that connection themselves. Of course, them cutting that out of the book, I can see why them cutting that little book element out of the films, I could see why they also decided to cut the relationship thing out of it. But now, earlier I did mention, even if they decide to keep the relationship angle intact from book to screen, wouldn't the casting choice for Abra, as they cast an African-American child actress to play her, be problematic? Not really as well, considering that the mother is played by a lighter-skinned actress, who I'm assuming is either I think she looked like she could have been Hispanic or Caucasian. I'd say probably looks more Hispanic, or she could be Italian too. Italian probably fit more if I remember. I think her mother's side of the family was supposed to be Italian. It shows a while. Don't have the names in front of me, and it shows it's been a while since I've read the book. So with that, it would work, in theory. They decided not to do it, of course, but it could have worked. And of course, he ended up killing off the dad anyway. That definitely didn't happen in the book, but it's just like them killing off Halloran in the original. They added a little bit more tragedy.